That did throw both Michael and myself for a loop, but that's part of the fun here at NCST. Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be speaking with you all today on this important topic. As something of a primer, about a year ago, NCST undertook a study of our full universe of partners that we've worked with over the last 15 plus years. The idea was centered around trying to better understand where the challenges are in acquiring properties, right? On an anecdotal level and a general level, there certainly was a sense that the kind of problems that community-based organizations, nonprofits that we work with, mission-minded for-profits, government agencies, the kind of problems that they were facing were the same as other more traditional buyers of real estate, right? Families looking to acquire homes, businesses looking to expand, et cetera. But there certainly were unique challenges, and we were aware of that when we undertook this project. So we sought to produce a survey and establish supplemental interviews that would help really unpack that, right? Get a full understanding of what was happening in that space, and in particular with nonprofits, and then look to the future for potential solutions. What would be those initiatives that would actually help aid those nonprofits in being more successful in acquiring properties, particularly at this moment when they're so scarce? What new muscles, if you will, do nonprofits need to build in order to be successful in a space where there's such scarcity of available properties, both distressed properties and others? And so we really sought to enhance the organizational capacity of those organizations, and again, really help strengthen them. We also wanted to be honest and ask ourselves the question of what is it that NCST, in what way were we uniquely positioned to actually undertake this research? And so for starters, we've been at this work, and when I say at this work, I mean supporting community-based organizations all around the country for over 15 years, and uniquely in the space of acquiring single-family properties, principally to create affordable home ownership. We have, over that time, conveyed over 28,000 properties. We've worked with over a total of 1,300 organizations, nonprofit organizations, mission-minded for-profits, and government agencies throughout the country. Literally in every corner, 48 states, working on 3,500 different municipalities with those organizations, and there's 300 of those organizations presently working with us as we speak. And so it was with that in mind that we concluded that this was really a ripe moment to actually evaluate those active partners, both the ones that were working with us 15 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, as well as those agencies that are working with us currently. We wanted to consider, first and foremost, what were the property sources and how were they actually accessing them? Historically, organizations that have come to NCST have found us because they're interested in partnering with us on our REO Match platform. That platform connects banks and non-bank mortgage servicers to acquire REO inventory, as the name suggests, right? It connects those institutions, those holders of foreclosed properties, with the community-based organizations that are actually looking to search them. Some of those organizations, by the way, they're working at a census tract level, right? They're working in a single neighborhood. Other organizations working across an entire city or entire metro. We have some statewide partners as well. So a diverse array of organizations, but the common denominator amongst them is that they're looking to acquire properties, and again, principally to create affordable home ownership. In addition to the REO Match platform, we look for back-end reporting, right? What we think of as post-closing reporting that helps us track the progress of those acquisitions through to their ultimate disposition. 80% of the time, that's creating an affordable home ownership opportunity. And more recently, we've moved into new ways to help those same organizations acquire new properties themselves. An example is a few years ago, we brought in FHA's CWCOT, Claims Without Conveyance of Title. Those properties have been historically made available through auction platforms, and we utilize our REO Match platform to notify that same universe of partners of those new opportunities. And maybe even more importantly, provide them with the additional support so they can help navigate the acquisition process of those properties and be successful with those outcomes while still on the back end tracking their progress. So when we're thinking about the survey itself, the first thing we needed to ask ourselves is what was the universe of potential partners that we would be looking at to acquire those properties? I mentioned that we've worked with organizations all throughout the country over our 15 plus years. And what we settled on was a universe of partner agencies, what we call community buyers. 658 in total. And these are organizations that have purchased a property at some point in their history through one of our programs. And that property needed to be a property of value, meaning not a donation. We also brought in the current universe of partners that are working with us presently. We got to a total of 658 agencies, and of that, 148 responded to our survey. And I really want to tip my hat to those organizations because it was an extensive and a rigorous survey, right? 30 plus questions, and we'll talk about some of those in detail, but it really did ask the survey respondent to consider deeply how their organization was functioning and what it was doing historically 5, 10, 15 years ago. In the end, 140 respondents came through, 96 of which were nonprofits, 32 mission-minded for-profits, and 12 government agencies. The common denominator, by the way, amongst them is that they needed to be focused again in acquiring single-family properties, and that's really again why they came to look for NCST in the first place. You can see here on the map that there's a wide array of respondents spread throughout the country. Certainly concentrations in the industrial Midwest, Illinois, Michigan, Ohio, but also in the Mid-Atlantic corridor, in the Northeast, southern states like Texas and Florida, and also in the western communities in Arizona and California. And then the survey itself. We broke this into 5 categories. First, starting with organizational overview and structure. So an example question here was asking the respondent to evaluate the organizational capacity over the years. What were their full-time equivalents 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago? How many persons were dedicated principally to this activity of identifying and acquiring single-family properties for rehabilitation? Project scope and community focus. An example question here, who are the primary end users or which communities does your program serve? Property acquisition activities and sources. An example question, consider your past experiences acquiring property and what have been the reasons for your organization to decide not to acquire that property. We also asked them to reflect on capital sources and financing challenges. What do you perceive as the greatest challenge in securing favorable financing terms and conditions for your organization? And then finally, a category of questions around partnerships, technical assistance, and legal and logistical resources. An example, in your experience, what legal impediments, restrictions, or ambiguities have hindered your organization or other nonprofit buyers from engaging in large-scale acquisitions? And so with that, I'm going to turn over to Michael Neal. Michael and his team at the Urban Institute compiled this data, and then they've produced a number of observations and recommendations moving forward.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Again, I'm Michael Neal, a researcher at the Urban Institute. Before we get into the background, let me first also build and extend my gratitude first to NCST, the amazing work that you guys are doing, working with Chris Garland here and his team has been illuminating and insightful. Also to all of the philanthropic and other supporters that have made this work and this event possible. Thank you so much. And here, I guess I'm on both sides of the table. Thank you to the Urban Institute. um, you're welcome. So I guess there's that too. For hosting this event. Um, let me build a little bit on what Chris has pointed out. They really took the time, I think, to put together a survey meant to. Oops, am I going in the right direction here? That's right. Okay. Whoops. Really meant to bring out the challenges, I think, in particular, associated with acquiring distressed properties. You're going to see that. And I think there's part of this story, certainly that's around market conditions. And that has implications for just the amount of distressed properties that are out there. But even when we get past that and go deeper, we do see these frictions. And what I think the data will show is that these frictions really seem to disproportionately affect nonprofits in a lot of ways, nonprofit buyers, but also the communities that they serve. And so that creates a very important and a very necessary response in terms of policy to address those types of barriers that keep organizations from being able to serve, particularly the communities that are more likely to be harmed. We already know, owing in part from the Great Recession, but from other events as well, that distressed properties can undermine different facets of the homeownership ecosystem. Certainly, displaced homeowners, loss of wealth, we remember that. But community implications in terms of house price changes, even blight, as well as issues around supply, but also the broader financial system that supports homeownership around lenders, around servicers, and other key participants. And so that kind of, in my mind, raises the importance of thinking and considering and ultimately responding to the presence of distressed properties because of the implications that it has at the individual level, at the community level, and at the broader macro level. As I said earlier, compared to where we were 15 years ago, and in some ways maybe where we were 5 years ago, the amount of distressed properties has come down. We have seen strong house price appreciation. We have seen lower unemployment. And that, combined with a number of other factors, has had the effect of reducing the presence of distressed properties. And at the same time, certainly what we see in terms of the inventory of NCST kind of matches that kind of national, broader home ownership story. So indicating that in part that the experiences of NCST are kind of parallel what's going on nationwide. But I think there's a deeper implication that the way the services and the activities of NCST are robust in a way that they match the challenges that the country faces itself. And so certainly, as I've already kind of mentioned, there is this story around the role that market conditions are playing in terms of, at least in terms of the counts of distressed properties. But as you will see, there are other challenges that still limit particularly the ability of mission-minded organizations to be able to acquire those the properties that are still available. We start off kind of on with this slide, kind of pointing out a couple things. Again, owing to some of the contextual comments that Chris has already provided, that certainly nonprofits have, over the last few years, purchased, acquired fewer distressed properties kind of compared to their for-profit counterparts. Now, it's also important to keep in mind that these for-profits are traverse that intersection of for-profit, but also mission-minded. So not solely for-profit, but they also have a mission associated with their work. Yet even still, what we see is that nonprofits are do in part have acquired fewer distressed properties relative to their for-profit counterparts. And part of that part of this story is rooted in the sources of these properties, certainly of property acquisition. Certainly when we think about nonprofits, we see that a large decline over the years in terms of where they have gotten properties from financial institutions, from private donations, and from federal programs. That in part stands in contrast to, I think, what we saw in terms of for-profits, where we saw a marked decline in terms of direct negotiation with property owners, short sales, as well as kind of partnerships with other nonprofits. So a key takeaway here is that, certainly the source of acquiring properties is different, number one. But number two, the intensity of the use of those sources has declined among a number of key dimensions. And again, certainly we talked a little bit about market conditions. On the one hand, market conditions have had the effect of reducing the number of distressed properties out in the universe. But at the same time, the market conditions have also played a role in terms of the challenges associated with acquiring distressed properties. Certainly, property prices, higher property prices, limited availability have had the effect of limiting their ability to acquire these types of properties. But note also that there is a bit of a difference. Nonprofits disproportionately impacted by property prices, but I also want to draw your attention to the disproportionate impact in terms of insufficient funding or financial constraints, where nearly half of nonprofits cited this as a challenge, compared to only 6% of for-profits. As well as challenges in securing favorable financing terms. And so this really starts to illustrate, I think, or at least suggest that more than market conditions are at play. That in fact, there may also be challenges, at least with respect to accessing capital, that may disproportionately impact nonprofits and their ability to serve their communities in today's age. But then part of the reason why that's important really emerges when we switch over to the other side of the ledger and start to think about the communities that they serve. And the left-hand side, indicates that certainly for-profit, again, mission-oriented, nonprofits, the majority of whom will serve historically marginalized communities, Latino communities, Black or African American communities, low-income individuals and families. But we also, from the survey, saw that nonprofits disproportionately served exactly these communities. So there is this story emerging of certainly market conditions reducing the amount of distressed properties out there, but that combined with financial constraints disproportionately limiting exactly the types of organizations that typically serve historically marginalized and disadvantaged communities. When we overlay that with the challenges in those communities, in particular here, the greater likelihood of these homeowners living in homes that are considered physically inadequate, it on one hand suggests a higher cost associated with not just acquiring the properties but also preparing them hopefully for another homeowner. But at the same time, it also suggests the additional challenges that distressed that properties in these communities may have in terms of their implications for that broader community. We know the implications of physically inadequate properties in terms of their implications for wealth outcomes, but also for health outcomes. So, certainly on the one hand, we've highlighted from the survey, I think we saw from the survey the challenges particularly associated with securing and accessing financing. Also saw that, those that are disproportionately impacted by that typically serve disadvantaged communities. But we also kind of see here some additional characteristics that differ nonprofits from for-profits that may also inform this particular important conversation. On the left-hand side, we see that nonprofits tend to purchase fewer properties when we look at that relative to the number of employees that they have. Again, suggesting that one implication associated with financial constraints, it may be a lower likelihood or reduced ability to actually purchase properties. At the same time, we also see on the right-hand side that nonprofits have smaller budgets. Smaller budgets suggest a lower likelihood of being able to purchase properties, combined with the greater likelihood that they're physically inadequate, combined with higher house prices, all kind of starts to create a narrative centered around what are the responses that we can bring to help these particular organizations serve historically disadvantaged communities. And so that kind of brings us to exactly that, that conversation. Certainly, again, providing additional funds, in particular for renovations, for repairs, that can help to preserve affordable housing is going to be critical. Certainly, nonprofit buyers who are most likely to work with affordable properties and sell them to owner-occupants appear to face more severe funding constraints. Second is around technical assistance. So the left-hand side indicates that nonprofits were more likely to use technical assistance. Again, this is a question from the survey. Fewer than half of both nonprofits and for-profits utilize technical assistance. But again, nonprofits were, on the one hand, more likely to use it. But on the other hand, the data suggests that if for those that did use technical assistance, nonprofits still acquired fewer properties relative to for-profits. And so it suggests, again, what a response around not just eliminating the financial constraints, but also what are the ways that we can look into and get a greater appreciation of the role that technical assistance can play, particularly for smaller organizations who are purchasing fewer properties relative to their size, but also serving communities where the challenges may be relatively greater. And then finally, coming back around to the challenges associating with securing financing, another question that the survey provided, and in this way, there's kind of a straightforward approach, which is to ask them not just what are the challenges that they're facing, but that then in turn informing kind of what the response can start to look like. Certainly, we see around limited availability of low interest loans or grants, being a key one, combined with high interest rates on loans. The responses are different, but they fall in that same bucket in terms of the role that interest rates are playing. But when we look specifically at some of the challenges nonprofits are say that they're experiencing, one of them appears to be, limited access to capital in certain communities. So it really starts to describe a narrative where we have less capital investment in these communities. These communities are more vulnerable. When we then turn and look at distressed properties and other properties more likely to live in physically inadequate homes. And this is the narrative, and these are the conditions against which nonprofits and other mission-oriented organizations are entering, seeking to serve and ultimately to eradicate, again, so that it does not have the adverse implications on people, on communities, and on the system overall. At the same time, financial models to benefit nonprofits, one of the some of the key responses that really jumped out around how can you develop targeted financial products or programs for nonprofits in communities of color. Establishing dedicated funds or initiatives focused on supporting nonprofit buyers in communities of color. And there are certainly others here on the slide, but again, I think it raises an important point that the degree to which these organizations are facing challenges with respect to capital, this might be some of the places where one could start to address that so that they can continue the work, so that we can expand their capacity in terms of their effort, particularly in historically disadvantaged communities. Thank you. Thank you. And our contact information is here for any questions that you might have, but I'm going to turn it back over to Chris to give some concluding remarks.
Thanks so much, Michael. Well, thanks so much, Michael. It really was eye-opening to see not just what we thought we were going to see, but then ultimately to be able to actually identify that through Michael and his team at the Housing Finance Policy Center at Urban Institute's research. And as Michael led with, it was really a wonderful experience working with him and his team. Speaking of that, this project couldn't have been completed without a number of fingerprints around NCST being involved. Chris Hoff and Matt Cameron were involved early on in helping to design the survey itself, but then also the tools that we could use in-house to collect that information. Jordan Backstrom and Raquel Reddy, deeply involved in helping to organize and orchestrate the supplemental interviews that we conducted with 14 of those 140 responses. And I'd be remiss if I didn't point out one, Ana Laura Tostado, who's really had her hands all over this project, was just tremendous. Ana Laura, your ability to synergize data, literally provide us with some early findings as they were coming through was remarkable. And in so many ways, this project wouldn't have been able to be completed without your good work. So thank you. So in summary, some key takeaways that were really eye-opening for us. I'm going to start with the bottom. First and foremost, both nonprofits and for-profits are purchasing fewer properties. And they've identified market conditions and high property prices as the key reasons to not acquire those properties. This came up time and time again, and of course, in Michael's analysis, it was front and center. But it's nonprofits that have the smaller budgets than their for-profit counterparts, while at the same time, it's those nonprofits that are disproportionately working and serving the most vulnerable communities, right? So it's a formula that needs to be recognized, and as Michael well articulated, nonprofits are already utilizing technical assistance, but perhaps not enough, right? And so there's an opportunity to both support those nonprofits that are deeply involved in technical assistance and helping to leverage that against some of the challenges that might exist in working in severely distressed communities with limited resources. And of course, there's an opportunity to work with even more of them. And we think that that's an opportunity that can be supported. And so moving forward, we really see a number of policy changes that ought to be recognized and elevated out of this work. First and foremost, addressing the key financial barriers to providing capital for rehabilitation, right? The development projects that we're talking about can't get completed without considerable financial resources, and particularly for those properties that are the most severely distressed. Better supporting and equipping nonprofits to purchase non-performing loans to preserve home ownership for vulnerable owners. We talked earlier about the HUD's, the FHA CWCOT program and needing to provide assistance so that nonprofits and others can be successful in utilizing that program and then bring those properties back into productive reuse and creating affordable home ownership. In the same way, we think there's an opportunity to support the nonprofit community that's involved in this work in utilizing non-performing loans as an additional universe to tap into and create affordable home ownership opportunities, and thereby contributing to the supply crisis that we're seeing here presently and addressing the racial home ownership gap. With that, a tremendous thank you to the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, who this project wouldn't have been able to be completed without their tremendous support. I want to thank you all. Again, thanks so much for your attention, and looking forward to the rest of today's symposium. Thanks a lot.